Eleanor Holmes Norton represents the District of Columbia in the U.S. House. Joe Madison, a veteran civil rights advocate. He's the morning man on Sirius XM's Urban View channel. Can't imagine having this discussion with anyone else. Thanks very much for being here today.
Thanks.
Talk about what Brown meant in the context of the time, Congresswoman Norton.
In real time, I was in a schoolroom in Dunbar High School. The announcement came in the afternoon. I suppose most children weren't told of the announcement, but at Dunbar, that's something you'd be told. And the principal, Charles Lofton, sounded the bell that told you there was an announcement about to be made. We had no idea what it was to be. And he announced that the schools where we sat, schools that were separated by race, by the government, had just been declared unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court. This was a decision of such momentum that teachers were seen with tears in their eyes. The whole school was joyful. Everyone understood exactly what it meant, particularly in a city which had been segregated by Congress of the United States, and where segregation was everywhere. Downtown was segregated. You couldn't go in public accommodations, and so it followed, of course, that here up South D.C., the schools would be segregated as well. It was a moment when Washington realized something had to be done, and to the credit of the school board, which had, of course, complied with segregation, the schools were almost immediately integrated.
Because in many places, Joe Madison, people thought, yes, let's give them an education, but I don't want my kid in a classroom with them.
And Bowling, D.C., their case was one of 5, I think, cases that made up Brown versus Board of Education.
Brown versus Board of Ed being a Kansas case, but as you say, all these cases on similar tracks.
That's right. And the one thing, as I remember, they all had in common, I'm choosing my words carefully because I'm sitting next to a constitutional law professor, is that they all had, in essence, failed in court in the sense that they all had been declared separate but equal cases. So they were separate but equal, separate but equal. And it wasn't just down south. It was also up north. I mean, we had segregated, racially separated, segregated schools up north. But what people also, I think, should find interesting is the pushback that they got even with a unanimous decision. Commonwealth of Virginia, instead of integrating its schools on a Supreme Court decision that was unanimous, what did they do? Shut down all their public schools.
Prince Edward.
The Prince Edward public
shut down there.
They would rather not have a public school system than comply.
And to this day, I know people that I served with on the board of the NAACP who were students at that time. Their parents literally had to send them out of state to go to school because the public schools
in Virginia has only recently begun to make amends to those children who went for years without any public education.
Can you talk about there were enormous efforts behind the scene within the court, from what we've read, to make sure that this was a unanimous decision? Was that almost an essential ingredient? We're so accustomed today to 5 rulings, sometimes 6-3 rulings, sometimes unanimous, especially in the, we do get unanimous rulings today, but it seemed like this one needed to be 9-0, and there was work within the court to make it that way. Did that send a stronger message even than a 5-4 ruling would have
Well,
sent?
it certainly did, but it didn't stop the massive resistance, as they called it. But imagine if it had been 5-4 or 6-3, and there hadn't been a unanimous sense in the country, at least in the court, that separate but equal was wrong. In the Bowling case, our case in D.C., it's important. All these cases were different in their own ways. Ours was different because the Congress segregated us, and because we had no home rule, and so it didn't come under the 14th Amendment. It came under the 5th Amendment. It had to be done differently. And it's interesting that instead of trying to show what they could easily have shown, that the schools were unequal here, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund must have decided that these cases should raise gradually the issue Our case simply said, separate but equal is unconstitutional.
Right.
The South Carolina case had come up trying to show the ways in which these disparities occurred.
Yeah.
Now, remember what a risk this was. These cases had been lost below, and the NAACP had to think very carefully whether you want to get a case like Plessy v. Ferguson, the case that declared separate but equal was okay, for another 50 years, and should you appeal these cases at all? These were really brilliant lawyers, and it was a very brilliant strategy.
And again, it was not just public schools, it was public accommodation is what they were, in essence, going after.
Well, they were, but that's interesting. This was only about public schools. And it, you know, the 60-foot, but the seeds were planted. If the state could not, in fact, segregate public schools, could the state segregate anything else? Now, public accommodation is different because that's private.
Transportation.
Yeah.
Movie theaters.
Well, movies, they are private.
They're private. This was public, you know, Plessy was transportation. And then you end up, of course, testing it with, coming out of that was Rosa Parks, coming out of that was the Freedom Bus Riders, and these cases had to be tested all the way through. I had a caller today whose uncle was part of the South Carolina case, and this whole separate but equal. So black teachers were paid less, black administrators were paid less. They agreed, okay, we'll have separate but equal, we'll load up and we'll provide buses for the white kids to go to school, and they said that the parents in South Carolina County had to buy their own bus, and then bought their own bus to take kids to schools, but ran out of gas. The bus would run out of gas money. Went to the public school superintendent to get gas money for their own bus, and they wouldn't give them gas money.
And the children in those schools, I remember in South Carolina, the ratio of teachers in the white schools was 28-1, for black schools 47-1.
I want to talk about the challenges today because we know that we have a different form of lack of integration today, and we do want to focus on that. Can you talk, though, for a moment about Dunbar? What made Dunbar special?
You know, it's easy to be nostalgic about Dunbar because this school produced so many really famous African Americans because it was, for a long time, the only, quote, college preparatory high school in the District of Columbia for Negro children. Well, the fact is that you could go to college from Cardozo High School. My father went to Cardozo and went to Syracuse University. But the school that had the reputation for sending people to college, and the school that all of the great universities came to recruit, was Dunbar. Isn't it interesting that the first African-American senator to be popularly elected was Edward Brooke? Where did he go? Dunbar High School. Where did he grow up? In D.C. He could not become a senator here. Of course, he's a senator from Massachusetts. So it's a school that nurtured children in a very special way, but anybody could go. It was like a magnet school. I took a bus and a streetcar to get there, and children did that from all over the district.
A report out this week, and I'm sure timed for the 60th anniversary of Brown, talks about the lack of integration, the sort of racial bifurcation, if you will, that exists in many communities in the schools today. And if you want to layer on top of that, we know that other systems have disparities in terms of classroom achievement that they've wrestled with for a long time. What are the challenges of today, Joe Madison?
Well, the challenge is that you deal with reactionary Republicans, Tea Party people who in essence want to, as A. Philip Randolph said in his 1963 speech at the March on Washington, look for the people who want to cut Medicaid, Medicare, public federal funding for public education. Look at the cuts to early childhood education. We just had a report come out that Washington, D.C., that spends a great money. It's the best investment that they could make when it comes to education. That was early childhood education. But when you are talking about cutting the budget, then you add to it housing discrimination. I mean, let me tell you, I started school 54, and by the time I reached high school, every white person I went to school with had moved out of our community.
Well, Joe, I think that's the heart of the problem. The Brown decision that said schools could not be legally segregated, could not do the whole job. There was housing discrimination. It abounds today. And of course there is inequalities. There are inequalities which have isolated our children into neighborhoods that keep, quote, integration from occurring. Brown could only say the state couldn't do it, and if you could find some kind of state action, and we did, that's why the busing occurred. They had to undo what they did. But then after busing, which was after all a temporary remedy, you can't bus children forever under Brown. You can only do it so long as you are showing you are trying to undo the effects of that segregation. After that, housing patterns took over, and housing discrimination in this country abounds, and inequality in schools based on income is rampant.
And there are certainly reinforcing patterns when you look at the sky-high cost of real estate in some areas. Only certain people can afford to move to certain areas. They're willing to invest based on sort of their views about the schools. There are reinforcing patterns that are digging our hole deeper.
But one of the reinforcing patterns, and I remember this very well, was redlining. I mean, that was a reinforcing pattern where a neighborhood would literally be redlined by what? A private institution, i.e. a mortgage company or a bank. And that simply added to this attempt to once again push back. So initially the pushback was violent outcry, was Little Rock, was, oh no, this is not going to happen, shut down a school in Virginia. But then it became more sophisticated, and as we call it today, the initial response was Jim Crow. Today it's James Crow Esquire, more sophisticated cousin of Jim Crow.
And New York has the largest, children are more racially isolated in New York. Only 10% of the children go to integrated schools, and that's in the North, than in the South.
A remarkable and probably sad fact of life. 60 years, the anniversary actually being tomorrow, we're sort of marking the occasion today, 60 years after the momentous, unanimous Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education. Eleanor, Holmes, Norton, Joe Madison, always great having you here, particularly great having you here today. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.